Last time I was here, I shared with you a message from a series that I did at Fellowship Church in St. Thomas called Arguing with Jesus, and we're looking at different sort of arguments and sort of, I guess, borderline fights that Jesus has with different people in the Bible. And so today I'd like to share another one of the messages that came out of that series, and we're going to be talking about arguing about the rules. And the reason why I use a series like this is because there's a tendency when people think about Jesus, you tend to think of Jesus as that turn the other cheek kind of guy, right? Those are the kind of statements that stick out to you. Turn the other cheek. We think of Jesus as being meek and patient and gentle, and that's partly true. That's partly true, but it's not entirely accurate, because Jesus was actually a lot more confrontational than people tend to think that he was. And he would, like I said, he would regularly get into debates and arguments, and not fist fights, but certainly verbal battles with people. And especially he would get into these things with people that were trying to take him down. Okay, the people that were trying to discredit him, trap him in his words, make him look foolish. And Jesus wasn't that kind of guy who would just, throw up the white flag and say, I don't want to argue. It's not my thing. I'm not that. No. He wouldn't just bow out. He would actually argue back. And some of his most well-known arguments were about topics that were not only relevant then, but I actually think are incredibly relevant for us today. So take this topic of morality or rules, for example. Okay, the topic of morality, this has become huge, a really huge issue over the past couple of years, okay, with the Me Too movements, right? The university entrance cheating scandal. I'm sure you've heard of that, right? Where rich people are bribing their kids into some of the most prestigious schools. There's a shocking report that came out a couple months ago about the salaries of some company CEOs being almost 1,000 times what the average employee in the company makes. Okay, so what's happening is people are having conversations everywhere about what is right and what's wrong. Okay, what is acceptable and when have we crossed that line and when have we now become unacceptable? What is moral and what is immoral? And of course, the challenge here is that there's all sorts of different views and opinions on this, right? And that's the problem. Everybody has a different opinion. But this is what I find really interesting. The one thing that most people seem to agree on is that morality is on the decline. The Montreal Gazette published an article on that very question. I find this fascinating. And this is the title of the article. This is what it said. It said, "Why is morality on the decline in North America?" And then it goes on and points to all sorts of examples as proof as to why they think morality is on the decline. Okay, so we got the widespread cheating in sports, the mass killing of strangers in public places, the epidemic of online bullying, the frequency of cheating in schools, scientists who fudge their research to make a buck, companies that are out there using their political influence to fight against regulations that are going to make them more accountable, people who cheat on their taxes, the guy who doesn't think twice about taking a box of pens and a stapler from work, and if that's you, we can go to Staples afterwards. I can help you out, okay? Now, they listed a couple of different reasons for this, and I'm not going to go into all the reasons, but I do want to talk about two that I think are really important and really intertwined, okay? So here, I'll start with one. Here in North America, our culture and our way of thinking has been shaped by a time in history back in the 17th and 18th century, and you're thinking, really, we're going that far back? And yeah, we're going that far back. 17th and 18th century, in this time period called, and maybe some of you have heard this before, the Enlightenment, okay? And the Enlightenment, what it basically taught us is that we need to look out for numero uno in life, okay? Number one. And who's number one? That's you, okay? So you need to look out for yourself. You need to make yourself the priority. So to be an individual is all that matters. Before this, communities and people were always a part of a greater whole and a greater sense of family or community. The Enlightenment says, no, you got to be an individual. Being an individual is all that matters. Being true to yourself. Okay, letting everybody just be what they want to be and go out there and do what they want to do. Ultimately, that's what's going to be best for individuals, but also for society. Now, you take that and you couple this with another trend, and the trend is a very sharp decline in religious affiliation, okay, in religious connection, in church attendance, in faith practices. You put those two things together, and I think what you have here is you've got a pretty lethal cocktail. Now, I got to throw this caveat out there because it's so important. I'm not saying that church attendance is a guarantee of anything, okay? I'm not saying that. But generally speaking, in the past, organized faith, organized communities of faith have offered or given to people ideas of what's right and wrong, and people have lived by those for centuries, right? They've followed them for centuries. But now, because less people are religious and people are more focused on the self, they're in a position now where they're more apt to judge for themselves what is right and what is wrong. And if they get to judge for themselves what's right and what's wrong, most often, they're going to do it based on what? Based on convenience, right? And self-interest. And it's doing a tremendous, tremendous amount of harm to the society and the world we live in. Now, I don't want to come in here with all doom and gloom. I'm not that kind of guy. So there is some good news to be had here, okay? Because apparently the millennial generation, certain segments of it, are realizing that we've got a big problem here. And they're starting to push back because a recent survey showed that many millennials actually hold values that are more conservative than those of their parents, okay? So there's hope. There's hope. It's not all doom and gloom. Now, here's the thing. Jesus actually debated and argued with people about this exact same thing over 2,000 years ago. Nothing is new under the sun, right? Everything comes back again. So in Mark 12, Jesus, he gets into a conversation with a Pharisee. And Mark describes it this way. He says, one of the teachers of religious law was standing there listening to the debate. And he realized that Jesus had answered well. Shocker. Okay, so he asked Jesus, he goes to Jesus, he asked him, of all the commandments, Jesus, which is the most important? Now, the last time I was here, and maybe you remember this, maybe you don't, I'll just refresh your memory. In Judaism, there were basically two religious groups, there were more, but two main sort of religious groups, okay? So we have the Sadducees on the one hand, and we have the Pharisees on the other. And in many ways, they're almost the exact opposite of each other. Okay, so the Sadducees were the guys who came from wealthy priest families. They had the best education, they had positions of power, and they had all the sort of honor and respect that came with that. Now, the Sadducees, they actually had a very simple, non-supernatural faith. Okay, they followed only the first 5 books of the Bible. Okay, and so they didn't believe in an afterlife, they didn't believe in a resurrection or anything like that. All that mattered was following the first 5 books of the Bible. That's it, that's all you do. Now the Pharisees in some ways are the exact opposite because they were from middle to low class families, super conservative, believed in a coming Savior, believed in resurrection, believed in life after death, and they hated the Sadducees as much as the Sadducees hated them, and both of them generally kind of hated Jesus. So Mark says this, he says, one of the teachers of religious law came and he heard them debating. Now, when you find that in the Bible, when you run across that, teachers of religious law, almost always we're referring to a Pharisee, okay, almost always. So this Pharisee, he overhears Jesus arguing with the group of Sadducees, and that's the story that we actually looked at together the last time I was here. And just to refresh your memory, there's this group of Sadducees who had tried to take Jesus down, make Jesus look foolish with this just ridiculous question about the afterlife, okay? And the 7 brothers who die after they all marry the same woman, and we got this question about whose wife is she going to be in heaven? It's a silly question, it's a crazy question. And Jesus did an absolutely amazing job of refuting them and putting them down. And so we have this Pharisee, and maybe this Pharisee kind of wandered in halfway. Maybe he's been there the whole time, and he's just standing off to the side, and he's kind of listening, right? And maybe he's keeping his distance, and And he's listening to how Jesus engages with these Sadducees, and he's actually a little bit impressed. He's actually quite impressed with Jesus. And so he decides that he's going to ask Jesus a really, really hot button, really, really controversial kind of question. And so he comes to Jesus and he says, hey, Jesus, those of us who are conservative, unlike those Sadducees over there, those of us who are conservative, we know that we must obey the law of God if we're going to get his blessings and his love and his acceptance. We know that. But we've figured out that there are at least 613 laws in the Bible. And by the way, just so you know, that's actually true. Okay, that's absolutely true. You thought there were 10? I told your kids there were 10? Sorry about that. There's way more than that. 613 distinguishable laws in the Bible, okay? And so he comes to Jesus. He says, look, Jesus, the reason we're debating this, and of course we'd like your professional opinion on this, is because we know that if we're going to get God's love, and we're going to get God's acceptance, and we're going to get his blessings, we need to obey the law. But my goodness, God, there's 613 of these things. 613, that's insane. That's insane. Like, how can anybody possibly follow 613 laws? If that's what it takes, then what hope does anybody really have? Right? Because you'll never be able to keep 613. So what I want to know is, what are the minimum requirements? Just the minimum requirements for getting into heaven. We can't obey all 613. Like some of those laws, come on, Jesus, they've got to be more important than others, right? So which ones do we have to obey? Now, you may be sitting here and you're thinking, okay, so that's kind of interesting. It's an interesting kind of question, but like, how relevant is that for me right here, right now? And here's the thing. I actually think this question here that he's asking is touching on a problem that actually a lot of people who are not Christians have when it comes to Christianity, okay? You mentioned in the prayer about, learning to share your faith. This is an issue that a lot of people have with Christianity. They think Christianity is really a massive set of rules. Okay, and that God, when they think of God and they look at God and they think of God as just this kind of strict judge who makes sure that the rules get followed. And if you don't follow the rules and you mess up, then what he does is he basically just condemns you and sends you to hell. That's the picture that a lot of people have of God. Now, they'll look at this and they'll say, hey, granted, some of the rules make sense. I'm not saying all rules are bad, right? Like, don't murder. I think that's pretty good. Like, I don't want to be murdered, right? Don't steal. That's good. Don't take my stuff. Like, that's mine. But then they'll look at some of the other ones and they'll say, well, but don't have sex outside of marriage? Really? Like, don't swear? Don't covet anything? Man, like, if I have to be that good, right? Like, if I have to be that perfect all the time, I'm never going to make it, and I don't even know if I want to make it. See, on the one hand, and I talked about this with the kids, right? Like, on the one hand, we can't live without rules. You know that. Like, it is totally, totally naive to think that you can live without rules, because nobody here in this building and in this world lives in a vacuum. Our actions always affect someone else. They always affect other people. And if everyone just went out there and did everything they wanted, anything and everything they wanted, without regard for someone else, it would be chaos. It would be sheer chaos. But then at the same time, we can't live with the rules either. Why? Because the rules crush us. And they're a burden. And man, there are a lot of rules. And I know I don't always do a good job of keeping them. So this Pharisee, he comes to Jesus. He says, Jesus, look, we know that there's a law. Okay, like, we get that. We know there's a moral law. We know there's a code of conduct for how we should live, the obligations. Like, Jesus, we're not so stupid as to think that we can just go out there and do whatever we want and make and write our own rules and decide what's right and wrong. We're not that dumb. But on the other hand, Jesus, we also realize that there's a problem with simply submitting to the rules, because if we say that we're just going to simply submit, we know that we're never going to be able to keep it up. It's just too hard. And we're always going to be guilty then, and then condemned, and we're going to be oppressed and unhappy. We're never going to make the mark. And so Jesus, just be straight with me. Of all the commandments, which is the most important? And so Jesus says this. He says, okay, here's the most important. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And then second, you have to love your neighbor as yourself. So just love God, right? And just love others. Just be a loving person. Now that sounds, I think, in some ways it sounds simple enough. And in some ways, I think, you could say it actually sounds quite modern, right? All you have to do is love. Just be a loving person, right? That's all you got to do. But Mark, and I don't know if you noticed this when we read this, but Mark tells us, this was the last sentence of the whole section we read. Mark says that when he said this, no one dared ask him any more questions. Okay, so when Jesus says this, the people there are so shocked. Like, I'm sure the Pharisees are there, the Sadducees are probably still hanging around. All these people are still hanging around. Everyone's so shocked by what he says that they're afraid to ask him anything else. Just shuts it right down. Now, I'm assuming that when we read that, right, like just love the Lord your God and love others, that probably wasn't our reaction. Like, we weren't really that shocked by that, right? So I want you to just entertain for a moment that perhaps we're missing the significance of something here. Like maybe what Jesus is talking about here, maybe it's just not as simple as one might think it is. And here's the thing, it's not, because what Jesus does here is Jesus totally redefines what people should be doing, what they should be doing, and why people should be doing it. Because most people at that point, they would have expected Jesus to go to like the 10 Commandments and maybe pick like one or two of them, right? Like, so, if I had to kind of narrow it down, I would focus on, this one, don't murder anybody or whatever. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't go to the 10 Commandments at all. Instead, Jesus chooses two verses in the Bible here. He chooses Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. And I want you to understand the significance of this, because the Sadducees are kicking around, right? Why? Because he's going to Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible, right? So Jesus is smart. He knows what he's doing. He goes to Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, and it says this. It says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And then what does he do? Does he go to a totally different part of the Bible? No, he knows the Sadducees are still kicking around. The Pharisees still believe in the first 5 books too. So he goes to Leviticus 19, verse 18. And it says this, love your neighbor as yourself. So he takes both of these, and then he says to this group, he says, that's what the rules are about. Right there. That's it. That's what the rules are about. Now, he's not saying that these are the most important rules. And he's not saying, hey, guys, just go out there and love, just be loving and forget all about the rules. No. He's saying love defines what it means to live by the rules, okay? Love is what the rules are all about. So you got to understand, it's not enough to just not steal. Okay, or to not murder, or to not have sex outside of marriage. If you're doing all of those things, so you're following the rules in that literal sense, but you're a mean person, and you're an ungenerous person, and you're a cold person, and you're an unapproachable person, you're missing the whole point, because the point of the rules is love. They all boil down to love. So let me give you an example. One of the commands is you shall not commit adultery. Now, Jesus says the rules are about love, and so that means that it's not enough to simply not have sex outside of marriage. The scope or the size of this rule is so much bigger than that, because this is about love. It's calling you to be a completely loving spouse. Okay? You shall not steal. That's another one. This is a rule. And if this rule is about love, then it's not just about not taking things that don't belong to you, but it's about also being an unselfish and a generous person towards others. See, love defines what it means to live by the rules. And the rules then define for us what it means to actually show love. Because, a lot of people will say, well, it's, like in this very modern mindset, like it's not about rules, it's just about being good, right? Like I want to be a good person. I'm trying to be a good person. I'm trying to be a loving person. And then I would sit there and I'd say, but well, how do you know what it looks like to be good or to be really loving? How do you know that you've really loved someone? And I've often wondered, like, if I were to ask them this, that most people, if they really had to kind of describe it, they would probably define what it means to be good and loving. And the conclusion that I come to, that if they were to find it, it would probably be almost identical to the rules. To the commands, right? Like a good person, what would most of us say? A good person is someone who's what? Unselfish, right? Like, I think we would agree on that, whether you're a Christian or not. Somebody who was generous. It's pretty universal, right? Faithful. Sounds pretty biblical to me. See, God didn't just give us rules to keep us busy. He gave them to us to show us how to love. So Jesus redefines what we should be doing, and then he goes on and redefines why we should be doing this. He says, love God first, and then what does he say? And he says, love your neighbor. Okay, love God first, then love your neighbor. So in other words, neighbor love, your love for your neighbor, this flows out of a heart that is filled with love for God. Now, I want you to understand this. If you follow the rules, okay, if you follow the rules for any other reason than what I just described, you are ultimately just like one of the Pharisees. Okay, you're following the rules, and you're hoping that by doing that, God's going to accept you, and that God's going to love you because you're toeing the line, you're following the rules. And then when you do that, the problem is you're right back to where you started, right? The rules become a burden. They're going to crush you because you don't know, did I measure up? Did I get it right? Have I done enough, kind of thing? So the only life-giving motivation that we could possibly have for following the rules, for doing all the things that God tells you to do with others, is because in your heart, you're already head over heels in love with Jesus Christ. You're head over heels in love with God. So you got to understand, you got to know in your heart that God already loves you. He already loves you. You have to already have an experience and relationship of complete love and acceptance and passion and delight in God simply for who he is. And then out of that, when you have that already in your heart and in your gut, your mind, like it's your whole being, when you have that, when you go out now and obey the rules, even if you do it imperfectly, it's still going to bring you all kinds of health and healing in your life and in everybody's life around you. And it's not going to be a burden. It's not going to crush you. So Jesus, he gives us a whole new way of perspective of looking at morality and the rules and the reasons for following those rules and the reasons for being moral. Now, the question I think that we got to tackle, and this is a pretty important question, it's a critical one, is how do you get a love relationship with God like that? Okay, because a lot of Christians, and I don't know where your background is and where you came from, but a lot of Christians were raised and taught that if you don't keep the rules, you don't get God's love, right? So, like, you better follow the rules or you're going to end up in that bad place called HE double hockey sticks, okay? So, you don't want to go there. So the question then that we really need to think about is how do we get a love relationship with God that actually becomes the motivation for keeping the rules, not vice versa, okay? And, maybe for those of you who aren't Christian, I don't know, maybe your background here this morning, maybe you got invited by a friend, or maybe you obviously have people that you know in your circles that aren't Christians. A question like this: where and how do you find a love relationship with God that would actually make you consider believing in and following his rules instead of making your own and defining for yourself what is right and wrong and moral and immoral? Okay. Now the Pharisee, this is interesting. The Pharisee says something to Jesus that tells us that at least he knows the first step. Okay, so he's got part of the puzzle here. He says this. He says, Jesus, you have spoken the truth by saying that there is only one God and no other. And I know it is important to love him with all my heart and all my understanding and all my strength and to love my neighbor as myself. This is the crux, okay? This is more important than to offer all of the burnt offerings and sacrifices required by the law. Now, the word for more important there, I think it's better translated as exceeds. So this is what he's saying. He's saying, look, I get it, Jesus. I get what you're saying, right? What the rules and the commands are asking for exceeds, like by far exceeds all the offerings and all the sacrifices that I could ever make. And you got to understand, like this is one of these like blow your mind kind of moments, right? Because the Pharisees, they believed and they taught that you could satisfy God. That was like the whole foundation of what they taught people. You know, you try your hardest to live a good life. Okay, you do your best, follow the rules. And yes, occasionally you're going to mess up. Okay, so what do you do then? Well, you go to the temple and you make some sacrifices and you ask for forgiveness, right? So 80 to 90% of the time you're getting it right, you're following the rules, and there's going to be 10 to 20% of the time where you're not. So you go in with your burnt offerings and sacrifices, you make them to God, and boom, you're in. God loves you, and God's going to accept you. But now he has this kind of epiphany moment in his life. And he's like, well, like, wait a second. Like, that's never going to work. That's never going to work, because if the rules are about love and the motivation for doing them is love, I'm never going to measure up because I'm a selfish person, right? Like, I'm a really self-centered person, and all the burnt offerings and all the sacrifices in the world, man, like if I went to the temple and I sat there for 24 hours a day just making sacrifices one after another, that would never cover it, because I'm constantly, always, forever and ever falling short. And you know what Jesus said to him? He said to him, right on, buddy. Now you're getting it. Now you're getting it. Now you're on your way. So the first step, you got to understand, the first step to getting away from being a religious person, okay, so from the pride of thinking God loves me because I follow the rules, or on the other side, the insecurity of thinking that God will never love me because I keep messing up all the time. The first step from being someone who doesn't believe at all and says that, hey, you know, the only thing that matters in life is that you live a good life without ever really having a definition of what a good life looks like, all the while living with the insecurity of knowing that there are a lot of times when you're actually not living a good life and not knowing how and in what way that's going to impact your time after the life here. The first step for any group is to admit that you're lost. Jesus says the only way to get a love beyond anything you dared believe is to admit that you're a less loving person than you ever dared believe. And the only way to know that you are enough is to admit that you haven't done, and you can never do enough. You have to admit that you can't do it. So either way, whether you're a Christian or you're not a Christian, the first step is the same. You can't do it. Step number one. Now, here's the interesting thing. Jesus is fascinating. Jesus actually doesn't tell him the second step. Okay? Now, I don't know what happened to the Pharisee and where he went from here. But we can get the second step. We just have to do a little bit of extra work. Okay? We got to pick it up from the context here. Now, Mark tells us that these arguments with the Sadducees and Pharisees happened the day after Jesus threw people out of the temple. And as part of that whole scenario, Jesus was also acting in that way, like the temple or this place where, you know, where people were making sacrifices wasn't important anymore. And it was kind of shocking to people because Jesus said things like this. He said, tear this temple down, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And so, and Jesus did all of that because what Jesus came here to do, and this is why he was doing it, he came to replace the temple. He came to replace it. He came here to replace that temple, that sacrifice place. He came to replace it with himself. And so even though Jesus doesn't come right out and say it here, the second step is that you have to see that Jesus is the one who offered the ultimate sacrifice for you. He offered himself. His sacrifice makes all of these other sacrifices and the temple and all that stuff obsolete. See, when Jesus was on the cross, he said this, right? You know this. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? In that moment, God had turned his back on his son because Jesus was taking on himself, in that moment, all of our missed moments to do good. He's taking all of our mistakes. He's taking all of our failures, all of our selfishness, and he's paying for all of that on the cross. And yet in this moment, he's abandoned by God, completely abandoned. He still says what? He still says, my God, my God, my God. That's profound. And maybe you're not tracking with me here. I'm going to help you out. He's going through all of this agony, right? He's being totally rejected and forsaken, and yet he's still calling him my God. He's still loving God. He's still clinging to God. Clearly not because of what he's getting, okay, because this is terrible. Clearly, he's not clinging to God for his own benefit in this moment. That is definitely not true. But he's clinging to God simply for who he is. And why did he do that? He did that for us. See, Jesus is the ultimate example of someone who loved God with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his mind, and all his strength. And he loved his neighbor more than he loved himself. He gave up his life. And when you see Jesus doing that, like picture that in your mind and print it on your heart. When you see Jesus doing that, finally now what you have is you have someone that you can follow who is safe and who died for you, who won't crush you. You need the rules. You absolutely need the rules, and yet you can't have the rules. Jesus comes in and Jesus says, look, I'm the one person that if you follow and if you submit to me because I died for you, you will find a love and a security and a peace in your life in spite of any mistakes that you're going to make. I'm going to give that to you. And then out of that kind of love relationship, out of that kind of confidence, you can now just go out there without fear or worry and do your best to try to follow the rules. Try to love me and to love others as best as you can. Okay, so the first step is you got to admit that you can't do it. The second step is that you got to know and believe that because of Jesus, I am more loved and completely accepted than I ever dared hope. Now, that first step, you can't do it. That destroys pride. Okay, that destroys any sense of self-sufficiency. Like, well, I'm doing pretty good, so, I'm keeping the rules. God will love me, okay? You can't do it. So there's no room for pride. There's no room for self-sufficiency when it comes to Jesus. That second step is that you're more loved and accepted by Jesus. You know what that destroys? That destroys fear and insecurity. Oh, I'll never measure up. God will never love me because I just can't I can't do things right. So why is morality on the decline? Well, again, there's lots of different reasons for that. Don't want to be overly simplistic, but the Enlightenment, okay, this belief that we should all be able to do whatever we want to do, coupled with a decline in religious connection and affiliation, I think has certainly played a pretty significant role. But again, and I want to be really clear about this, I want you to know that the answer is not more people just going to church. Now, I love the church. Okay, I do. But the answer is not more people just being in a church. The answer is more people encountering and experiencing the love of Jesus Christ. That's the answer. Now, granted, being in a church is where you learn about his love. I get that. And you grow in that love relationship. But simply speaking, being in church is no guarantee. It's not a guarantee. You have to accept in your heart that you can't do it. Whether you're trying to get God to accept you or you're out there just trying to live a good life, and, you got to be honest with yourself. Can you really do it? Can you really do it? And if you think you can, let me ask you this. How do you know when it's done? How do you know? So you got to accept that you can't do it, and then you got to come to know the one who can and did do it for you. The one who didn't raise that white flag in the face of opposition, who didn't bow out, but actually fought back. And because he loved you, actually fought to the death so that we could have someone to follow who is safe and loving even when we're at our worst. If we all had that, think about it. If we all had that, and if we all obeyed the rules out of a relationship of love with Jesus Christ like that, just think about how different the world would really be. Now, only you know where you're at in this journey, whether you have a relationship or not with God like that, whether you're obeying to get his love or you're obeying because of his love, right? Or whether you're just really just trying to be good, like that's your goal in life, just be a good person. But here's the thing, there's no other way to security and peace in your life and in the world than through Jesus Christ. That I know for sure. And so come to him. And if you're not sure where to start, right? Like you're thinking, okay, I get it, but where do I even start on a journey like that? Well, I think you can start by just praying a simple prayer like this. Okay? Jesus, I know that I can't do it, but I believe that you can and that you did it for me. So help me to know the love that you have for me and with a full heart then to love you and to love others. And then go and read one of the accounts of Jesus' life. Learn about Jesus and his love for you. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. See the love of Jesus for you in action. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your love. And we thank you that it's a love that comes to us unconditionally, that it's not conditional upon us following 613 rules in the Bible. And it's not even conditional upon us following 10. Lord, it's an unconditional love. You gave up your son. He followed the rules. He loved you with all of his heart, soul, strength, mind, everything. And he loved his neighbor more than he loved himself. He gave up his life for us. And because of that, we have someone to follow now. We have a love in our heart that allows us to follow the rules and want to obey the rules, but even when we mess up, to not be crushed by the rules, because we know that we are loved and we are accepted through Jesus Christ. God, we thank you for the rules. We thank you for how they lead and they guide us in life, and they provide boundaries for safety and for our well-being, and teach us how to enjoy the world the way the world ought to be enjoyed. Sometimes we'll look at rules and we say, well, that's about taking away our fun. And yet if we're really honest about it and we look at the rules and we see, if we were to take one of your rules, say, okay, we're not going to do that. What are the consequences of that? And the pain and the heartache and the hurt that brings into our lives and the lives of others around us. And so we thank you for rules, and we thank you for boundaries. We thank you for loving us enough and caring about us enough to give us the rules. And so, God, we thank you for your love that fills our hearts. Lord, and we thank you that love then moves us to obey the rules and to try to love you and love others as best as we can. And when we mess up, to receive the forgiveness again that you've given to us unconditionally. And God, maybe, we're thinking about where we're at here this morning and what kind of relationship we have with you. And again, we're just maybe not even sure where to start this process. And so, God, if that's us, then I just pray that we'll pray this simple prayer. And I'll say it again, and maybe you can just say it in your own heart and mind, quietly to yourself. Jesus, I know that I can't do it. That's the first step. But I believe, and here's the second step, but I believe that you can and that you did it for me. Help me to know the love that you have for me, and with a full heart to love you and to love others. Amen. Let's stand and sing, My Jesus, I Love Thee.